Well, the high-stakes showdown with Iran could be reaching a breaking point. President Trump eviscerating the terror regime's lackluster counterproposal to the latest U.S. peace proposal. Here's what 47 said earlier.
A lot of people said, well, does he have a plan? Yeah, of course I do have. I have the best plan ever. A very simple plan. I don't know why you don't say it like it is. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And they give us it's a stupid proposal. And nobody would take it, although Obama would have taken it, Biden would have taken it. What they took was far worse. You have the moderates and you have the lunatics. And I think the moderates are more respected. The lunatics want to fight till the end.
For the time being, the ceasefire remains in place?
You know, it's unbelievably weak. I would say, I would call it the weakest right now. After reading that piece of garbage they sent us, I didn't even finish reading it. They said, I'm not going to waste my time reading it. I would say it's one of the weakest right now. It's on life support.
And leave it to the Dems to always root for America's failure in the conflict with Iran, just as a way to try to stick it to President Trump.
This conflict has been a massive disaster, and Donald Trump himself is an embarrassment on the world stage.
What is a president willing to give up? What are the Iranians willing to accept? And they're now in a better position than they were, ironically, several months ago.
And negotiate. It also points out why it was so stupid to start this war in the first place. It's actually put Iran in a stronger position, at least for now.
Kellyanne, can you please help make sense of this and why the Democrats, or how the Democrats, can say that Iran's in a stronger position now?
Well, they're clearly not. Ask the IRGC how they're feeling. 3 short months ago, they had a Navy. They had endless stockpiles of missiles. They had copious amounts of drones. Now they are militarily degraded, economically decimated. Several dozen of its leaders are as dead as the 42,000 peaceful protesters that they killed. And the list goes on. And the president holds all the cards. The U.S. is in a very strong position here, Emily, because this is what leadership looked like. We have a commander-in-chief who's not going to do what other presidents did: coddle, capitulate, and cave to the state sponsor of terror, the largest in the world. The calls for death to America and death to Israel were so loud that there's a guy that won't ignore it anymore. He won't look the other way at this inhumane state sponsor of terrorism who has killed more Americans than pretty much any other country. Wake up, everybody. And look, Jack Reed saying that is just false. You're allowed to say what you want on TV. He's not under oath. In fact, when he's interviewing witnesses on his committees in the United States Senate, the witnesses are under oath. Jack Reed and Cory Booker never are. So they have no incentive to ever tell the truth. How in the world, by any measure, is Iran in a better place now? Just 2 weeks ago, or last week, they tried to shoot at 2 of our destroyers and couldn't even come close. They were like a kid at a carnival game with a water pistol. So to say Iran's in a better position, Iran was in a much better position when Barack Obama was giving them billions of dollars, pallets of cash. They were in a much better position when John Kerry went over there to negotiate the JCPOA. They were in a much better position when Israel was on its heels. They were in a much better position when the Gulf states weren't helping us out. And so by any measure, we are winning. But war takes time, and I would remind my people, I would remind my friends who have objections to this war, peace through strength also necessitates the strength part as well. Last point, because Cory Booker, New Jersey, what do we have, 10 million people now, my home state? I'm a Jersey girl forever. We can't do better than this guy. He's so jealous of Donald Trump that it makes him zealous about a war that the U.S. is winning. He represents the United States of America. He ought to behave like that when he's on a Sunday show. Look at him. He ran for president in 2020. Cue the laughter. He ran for president, and you know how many electoral votes he got? 0. The same number as Kamala Harris, the same number as all these people who are jealous of Donald Trump because he's the president and Cory Booker's not. What is his body of work? What is he doing that he's giving China and North Korea aid and comfort to insult our commander-in-chief and our president when he's on his way to China to show who the real superpower is?
0, the same number of hairs on his head, Kennedy.
Yes.
Talk to us about, too,
And he also was a lackluster tight end at Stanford, I'm told.
Oh,
I know.
that explains a lot, doesn't it?
Exactly right. Yes, it does.
talk to us about the future for us and for Iran, like what we could expect, because it seems like the Democrats are expecting either instantaneous results and instant gratification with zero forgiveness for movement, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And also it seems like they're unprepared for a stronger alliance with the Gulf states, with the United States, which is what is happening.
It's interesting. You're absolutely right about that. And I think that the United States and Israel are looking at this in 2 very different ways. Israel is more hawkish here. They want to extract the uranium from the ground with or without a deal, and they've been telegraphing that pretty clearly. And I think if you look at what the United States is doing, they have a more global strategy. And I don't mean that in terms of the planet. I mean in terms of pulling out and wanting to make sure that there is peace going forward. And, you know, this is sort of a multi-layered part of the president's foreign policy. And I'm one of those people, I don't like war. I don't like conflict. I think the quagmire that you could get yourself into very quickly oftentimes isn't worth it. But I will give the president enough grace to say, if this is something where it started with the Abraham Accords that he is only going to add on to, and it is going to change the face of especially energy policy in the Middle East to make us all safer and to make countries like Iran that wants to cooperate with their neighbors, if it is going to help people who were displaced by the revolution in the late 70s, if they can go back to their homeland, then those are all net benefits. And it also, if peace and prosperity are the goal, then that is the American foreign policy that everyone should stand behind. And I think we have to be very careful of not demonizing everything the president does, because it also comes off being very anti-American. And you have to be able to, if there are wins, you have to be able to grant those if you ever want to build upon them, if Democrats regain Congress and at some point the presidency.
Especially with our military servicemen and women fighting overseas and in harm's way. Charlie, I have a question, and it's on that tack, because there's a fissure, frankly, between the Republican Party, where many say that Israel has different objectives and therefore we should not have yoked ourselves to our ally. But to Kennedy's point, don't we have a shared interest in obliterating, to use Hillary Clinton's terminology about Iran, a sworn enemy that the can was just being kicked down the road from prior administrations?
Well, I think one of the dumbest things that we have heard from some quarters on the right of Trump supporters or former Trump supporters is this idea that Trump is acting at the behest of Israel. It's absurd, as if America doesn't have any interest in the Middle East in terms of oil and things like that. It's absurd. Donald Trump, if anybody knows anything about Donald Trump, you know he's not going to be working at the behest of anybody other than, I think, the United States of America. But I think Kennedy also makes a really, really great point. And you're against war. I'm against war. You know who else is against war? Donald Trump is against war. He doesn't want to do this. He recognized that this was a real problem and it needed to be addressed, so much so that he was willing to do it in the middle of an election year, which there's not a single politician in our lifetime who has ever had the guts to do something like that. And he did it because he actually believed in it. And one of the things that I think gets lost in all of this is, like you say, if they're going to build on the Abraham Accords and actually solve a problem that has been a nightmare for our country for decades, especially over the past 25 years, where we have been embroiled in some unending wars, if it ends the incentive for future politicians to get involved in never-ending wars in the Middle East, I give him all the grace period that he needs in order to accomplish that, because I trust this guy way more than I trust any of the buffoons that might follow him and get us into another one of these stupid wars.
Yeah, let's say you.
Well, you know, it's interesting because we have this back and forth with Democrats and Republicans. Obviously, I'm not listening to any of these Democrats who are, you know, trumpeting this, you know, Iran is in a better position. It's nonsense. And I think most people know that. But I am tuning into various voices who are against the war. I'm like, sell me on this. Because to me, it looks like the U.S. is in a very advantageous position. So I want to hear from these people, maybe like-minded people, maybe people on the right, but they haven't sold me. But you know who has? I have this app on my phone. I listen to radio stations all around the world. It's great. The world and in Europe, they have a rosier view of this war than you would expect. And the headline that jumps out, multinational coalition seeks to secure Hormuz. What are they talking about? The U.S., Israel? No, it's France and the U.K. They're in there now. Add that to Saudi Arabia, UAE. I just wrote these down. These are all helping out the U.S. effort in the region. Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait. So if you look at the way the world is reacting to this, instead of U.S. politics, you see it's a lot closer to what Donald Trump, his description of what's happening there. And the, this back and forth, it's to be expected, right? But look what is going on. And, that's the way it's proceeding.
Yeah, a multinational coalescence. And to underscore your point, this is why the Secretary of War said his biggest adversary are the Democrats on the Hill.
Be sure to like and subscribe for all the Fox News latest on YouTube and catch full shows streaming now on Fox One.